My name's Michael Lee, and I've been asked today to do a webinar here with regards to the assessment of damages for overseas clients. Now, just a little bit about myself. Firstly, you can probably see me down in the corner there. I can see myself, and I've aged substantially since that photo was taken. But as an aside, I'm one of the directors in our forensic insurance division, and my speciality relates to the assessment of damages with regards to personal injuries claims, and equally with regards to dependency claims. I have a particular interest with regard to the assessment of damages for overseas clients, and in that particular sense, I sort of run through my book, if you want, over all the years, and noticed that I've probably done claims for in excess of 30 different countries around the world, and included within that, I've probably done claims and reports for people from probably about 140 to 150 claimants from overseas. I might say that from my point of view, one of the funniest things in doing that is that I've got my marketing people here telling me that I'm frozen. But you can hear me, can't you? Yeah.
It's all on.
You can still hear me, but but as I was saying, sorry, I'm just being told that the screen had frozen. But with regard to over all those different claims, one of the more unfortunate things is that whilst every solicitor that on those claims has actually gone for a trip overseas to see their claimants, I've only actually got two. So I might need to do something about that in the future. Now, the big thing with regards to these types of claims is, and what makes them a little bit more difficult, is that whilst they still have the same underlying rules as far as the assessment of damages, namely being a comparison of the notional earnings versus the actual earnings, the big point with regards to these is because it happens to result as it relates to the benefits taxation or pensions for the where the claimant actually resides. Now, to give you an idea, there was a decision last year that I was fortunate enough to be involved in called Yamaguchi and Phipps, and in that decision we were able to get a lot of guidance as to how you actually go about assessing the damages for claimants who were overseas. And just a bit of a background with regard to that case. Ms. Yamaguchi came out from Japan with a friend of hers, Miss Takio, and they just arrived at Cairns. They had essentially gone from the airport, went straight to their hotel, had a shower, freshened up, and then decided that they'd go out and have a look at Cairns, and proceeded to walk outside the hotel, walked out to cross the road, went across the pedestrian crossing, and were taken out by a bus which collided with both of them. And as a result of that, Ms. Takio had some pretty severe injuries, but Ms. Yamaguchi had some extremely severe injuries. So that was sort of the basis of that particular action. And what we found in that case was that that gave me to look at all these different issues was that Ms. Takio was actually, Ms. Yamaguchi, I should say, was actually going to return back to Japan after her holiday and then essentially start her career. Now, the types of things that you need to consider as a result of if you've got a claimant who happens to come from overseas predominantly relate to A, income tax returns, B, the earnings that they would have received, C, the deductions that they would have had, then making sure that you take account of income tax, having a look at when they actually would have retired, having a look at the pension or the superannuation system that they would have been in, considering then whether or not you need to look at exchange rates as far as the assessment of the damages, and then equally looking with regards to discounts for contingencies and vicissitudes. So I'll sort of run through each of them, and the big thing is that I know that in all claims, that we have here in Australia, that you're essentially asked to prove your earnings, and one of those things is to look at a person's income tax returns. The big thing to understand with regards to overseas claimants is that whilst the tax returns that you get are different in a form, what they actually do is they actually normally contain very similar information. And that's, for example, looking at whether or not the types of information that you're going to need. Now, in all the years I'm looking at income tax returns from around the world, you find some pretty surprising things. The tax return for Tonga is 3 pages long, and the first page is just where you put your name. And the other one that I found, which was quite interesting, was Portugal, where the standard income tax return was actually 98 pages long. So if you think that they're quite large in Australia, you're lucky you don't live in Portugal. Now, the big thing to understand is, just like other countries, as I've said, they disclose, firstly, the sources of your taxable income, also show you deductions. But what you need to consider is that in some countries, whereas in Australia we file individual tax returns, in some countries, for example, they file a joint return. So, for example, if you happen to be in the United States and there's Patsy and Nick who are married, they may elect that either Patsy does her own individual tax return and Nick does his own individual tax return, or alternatively, Patsy and Nick might decide that they're going to do a joint return in which they both put in their sources of income and deductions. And why do they do either separate or joint returns? Well, really what that depends upon is, in certain circumstances, that they're allowed in that particular country to get better tax deductions or a better tax position if they file jointly as opposed to individually. Now, as far as earnings are concerned, there's a couple of things to understand with regards to earnings in particular countries, and it's always first to understand with regards to certain cultural issues. I remember doing a case years ago involving a young girl from Japan who had been in Australia, and she happened to be working as a farmhand. And she previously worked as a teacher in Japan. And she'd come out for a working holiday. She was working as a farmhand, and in part of it, she actually lost a finger in a piece of plant and equipment. She subsequently went back to Japan and went back to being a teacher. And the problem that she then had was that not so much that she wasn't able to teach, because she was, but from a cultural point of view, the missing a finger had if you could say, a suggestion that she had been involved with the local mafia, because what they do is they actually chop off your fingers if you happen to cross them. And the children themselves found that very, very difficult to deal with, and actually quite frightening that a person was missing a finger. So in that particular case, the young girl actually was moved out of her teaching job and had to go and do another position because she wasn't actually allowed to teach anymore for fear of actually scaring the children. So there are cultural issues that you need to take account of when you're looking at earnings from overseas. The other thing that you need to understand is that there's other benefits. Now, for example, whilst in Australia we might have certain things as far as salary packaging is concerned, in other countries around the world there are people that have other benefits. And I think that one of the things to understand is that in countries such as the United States, an additional benefit may be the type of health care program that your employer is going to put you in. In a lot of Asian countries, what you'll find is that they receive what they call a 13-month bonus, and that's actually that you actually get paid for 13 months as opposed to 12. It's just that you get an extra one once a year. And considering the United States, that a big form of, for some people, a big form of their earnings is actually tips. If you've ever been in the United States, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about there. So the other part that we need to really think about when we're doing these things is currency conversions. So sometimes you come across where you don't know exactly what a person in a different country may actually be able to make. You might be able to look at salary surveys and things or historical earnings and say, well, you know, in Italy, this is what people get paid. But in some cases, you can't actually work out precisely or get a general sort of estimate as to what people earn. Now, in that case, you've got to do a currency conversion. You might look at Australia and you might say, well, you know, a person who happens to work in the hospitality industry earns X amount of dollars. The thing to understand is when you're trying to convert that across to, for example, in Italy, you don't just do a straight currency conversion. Because what the currency conversion does is it does just tells you what it is as far as the relative currencies across between the two countries. But what it doesn't do is that it doesn't take account of the standard of living in a particular country. Now, we're fortunate is that there are a number of different indexes that can be used to try and take account of standard of living. One is an OECD which is a purchasing parity index, and the other one is what they call a Big Mac index, which strangely says that you can compare the price of a Big Mac here and any other place around the world and work out the difference in the standard of living, because essentially it's made from the same key ingredients no matter where you happen to be in the world. So if you're going to do these types of currency conversions, it's just make sure that you're looking at what the appropriate way to make that adjustment is. Now, the next issue that I want to go through is deductions, and as we all know, in Australia, what you have to do is you have to substantiate your deductions. And if you don't substantiate your deductions, well, the Australian Tax Office will say that you're not allowed to actually have them. The thing to understand is that whilst in Australia we have to substantiate our deductions, in some countries that's not actually the case. In some countries, they allow you what they call standard deduction. And that deduction is really just saying that you can actually claim a certain amount of money as distinct from what the actual cost of those deductions really are. So it's important when you're looking in any particular claim involving a person from overseas to understand that if you are going to take account of deductions, that you make sure that you actually use the actual cost as opposed to what the allowable deduction is. The other thing to understand is that whilst you're allowed to claim that standard deduction as far as determining what your tax is, what you may do is you actually may take off that to make sure that you actually get the tax benefit, but then make sure that when you're doing your calculations, you actually use the real cost in determining what the after-tax earnings would be. Now, one of the other things that you'll find is that whilst in Australia, we all pretty much, can head to a particular calculator, or we know what the different tax rates happen to be. If you're going to do an assessment of damages for a person from overseas, you just have to make sure that you're aware of the rates and the types of taxes that you are going to pay in a particular country. And the thing to understand is that in some countries around the world, the income tax that you pay is not just purely based on your income. And probably a notable one there is with regards to Switzerland. Now, in Switzerland, you not only pay tax based on your income, but you also pay a property tax based on the value of the property that you have. The other thing to understand is that in some countries, it depends about where you actually live as to the amount of tax that you pay. And that's a big thing with regards to Switzerland, for example, and equally within Japan. They have different tax rates depending upon which particular city or which local area that you happen to live. So it's important in that case to actually work it out. Now, I mentioned the property tax there before, but equally in some countries, you've got to keep in mind that there are wealth taxes as well. So depending on what the level of your assets are, then you have to take account of the amount of tax that you're going to pay based on that. The other thing to understand is that in certain countries, they actually take out specific taxes with regards to your social security. Now, that happens to be predominantly, in my experience, in a lot of the Scandinavian type countries who have a very, if you could say, a very generous social security system. And the way that is actually done is by taxing you whilst you happen to be working. So you need to consider those types of things as well. The other part about it is lump sum payments. Now, the reason I raise this is that whilst in Australia we say that any payments for income taxes, for any damages are not subject to income tax, you may need to consider that with regards to another country that you happen to be assessing your client for. Now, I say that because essentially what happens is that the Tax Act in Australia says that damages for loss of earning capacity or loss of earnings as a result of personal injury are actually exempt under the Tax Act. So in order to ensure that people aren't overly compensated, what we do is we work out what the gross amounts are and then take off those particular taxes. Now, consider this: there are countries around the world where lump sum payments for personal injury are actually assessable income. So whereas in Australia we've said that it's exempt, it's to understand that in particular countries around the world, some of these damages are actually taxable. Now, in that case, how do you deal with it? Now, in the matters that I've dealt with where that happens to be the case, there's a number of different sort of options that you may ask an insurer to assist you with. But one of the ones is, do you actually gross up the damages to take account of any additional tax that you may have to pay? And understanding that any sort of amounts may actually give rise to, then again, another head of loss which is taxable. It's not an easy sort of area, but you just need to be fully aware of that. Some cases, what you might do, I've had it with regards to a number of clients in New Zealand, is that you might actually go to the local Inland and Revenue or equivalent of the ATO and ask them, would they give you a ruling whether or not this particular damage or this particular payout would be taxable or not, before you happen to go and settle the matter. Now, the next thing to understand is retirement age. And the reason I raise that is that whilst in Australia, we seem to have this tendency these days to use a pensionable age, namely at the moment 67 as the basis of when a person would retire. The thing to understand is that ultimately it's a question of fact. When a particular person is going to retire isn't necessarily what happens to be the pensionable age at any particular point in time. And really, as I say here, there is no hard or fast rule how you would actually calculate or ascertain. And you really need to go back and talk to your particular client as to when they would have actually retired. And in doing so, there are some issues that you probably want to consider, and particularly with the overseas claimants. The first is, what is the pension system that they actually operate in? In particular countries, it may be that you're able to access a pension in particular different ages. I've found over the years that there are some very, very extremely peculiar systems. I had one, I think it was in Bangladesh, where you had to ask yourself whether or not this person happened to be a freedom fighter. Because if you happen to be a freedom fighter, well, your pension, the age at which you could actually access your pension was different from non-freedom fighters. Other countries, there happened to be, up until a point in time, the retirement age was, I think in one case, 47. And then they realised that they couldn't sustain their economy anymore doing that. And the next day it went up to 67. So there are all these different sorts of facts that you probably want to think about as far as, as that pension system. The other thing is to consider gender. In some countries, females will have access to a pension or retirement at a lower age than men, and that's particularly the case, for example, with regards to China. The other thing is to talk about industry. In some countries around the world, depending on what particular industry you work in, depends upon when you're actually allowed to retire. Again, that's predominantly in China, where if you work in a very labour-intensive occupation, they actually allow you to retire at a younger date. And the other thing is location. Again, that's very specific with regards to China. And in some parts, for example, if you work in a particular area of China where it, for example, is extremely cold, it's a similar thing. They'll actually allow you to retire at a much lower age than somebody else, for example, that may be in the south part of China. And in some cases, quite interestingly, depending upon the number of children that you have, will determine when you're actually allowed to retire. And it's not so many how many children you have at the time of retirement, but it's how many children you've had whilst during your life. So there are some very interesting things to consider depending on which country that your client's from. And of course, there are always going to be a myriad of other issues that you want to think about. For example, does the person have enough money to actually retire? It might be the case that a person, as a result of certain things, can't actually retire when they normally would have liked, and actually has to work further in order to get a sufficient amount of money to have a decent retirement. Now, having talked about what the retirement age is, the big thing to understand now is, and have a think about, what happens to be the pension or retirement system in which your claimant will have operated. And what I say here is that I think a lot of us over time, a lot of legal practitioners over time have adopted an approach of just using a rule of thumb in order to ascertain what they happen to think is the damages. For example, in Australia, our loss of superannuation, a lot of the rules of thumb that have been used in order to work out what that loss of superannuation is. And I'd say this to you is that the use of a rule of thumb, even in Australia, is not the type of thing that you want to use. And the reason I say that is that if you don't take account of the particular pension system that operates, you will pretty much in every single circumstance ensure that the amount that you actually calculate is actually wrong. So I wouldn't actually use a rule of thumb at all if I happen to be dealing with an overseas client. Now, what you need to do is actually consider what the actual system is and how it actually operates in that particular country. And in certain countries, there are very, very generous pension systems. As I mentioned before, we were talking about, that one of the deductions that sometimes people make is a deduction towards their social security system. And in a number of these Scandinavian countries, whilst you pay a fair amount of tax along the way, and in some cases up to 60-odd%, or 60+%, some of those taxes that you actually pay are going to bring about a rather generous pension system into the future. So what you need to do is understand that whilst in Australia we have pretty much a standard sort of superannuation system as far as superannuation guarantee levies are concerned, in other countries it can be quite different as to how they actually operate and how the amounts are actually calculated. In some countries such as Germany, they have different types of systems just depending upon which particular industry or occupation that you happen to have, or if you work for government, or whether or not you work in a particular industry. So what you need to do is, in each particular case, find out what is the relevant system and how does it actually operate. Now, this was a particular issue in Yamaguchi, and in that particular case, what I had to do was try and actually work out what the amount would be under the Japanese pension system, and it's not exactly an easy sort of system to use and understand, but essentially, whilst in most cases, if you use that rule of thumb, you might say that, the loss of superannuation was, approximately, I think these days there's rules of thumb, 11.3% in Queensland, up to, 14+ in New South Wales. in this particular case, by actually looking at how that system actually worked, it turned out that the loss of the pension, in actual fact, was about 21.5% of the economic loss. So it's going back to that system where I said that, don't use a rule of thumb, because you're going to get it wrong pretty much in every case that you do. You do need to look at exactly how things operate in that particular country. Now, the other thing that you need to understand is with regards to exchange rates. Now, the thing to understand is that there will be some heads of loss that will be calculated in Australian dollars. And the types of things that I'm talking about there relate to, for example, your general damages. It may be that there was some special damages that happened to be incurred here, or it may be that some of your out-of-pocket sort of expenses for medicals and things like that happen to be incurred in Australia. Whereas on the other side of the equation, what you'll try and do is you will try and calculate the loss from the financial losses in the currency of the country in which they happen to reside. Now, there are going to be some circumstances where, for example, you may find that your client was going to stay in Australia on a work visa for, it might be a year or something like that. In which case you have to calculate what the losses would have been in Australian dollars during that period of time before they went back to their country of origin. So how do you deal with this as far as ultimately coming up with an amount of money and then working out what is the appropriate exchange rate that you should do to convert it to the currency in which the claimant now lives? Well, again, we dealt with this particular issue in Yamaguchi, and the question was, well, what is the appropriate exchange rate that you should use? Should you use a spot rate at the time of the settlement or the trial, or should you look at an average rate with regards to the period of time since the particular incident or accident up until the date of the trial or settlement? And after having worked that out, well, what should you use? Should you use a Reserve Bank of Australia rate, which essentially is the rate at which reserve banks or governing banks in different countries conduct and transact with each other? Or should you be using a commercial rate that you might have to incur if you, for example, went down to your local bank to try and get some currency from another country? Well, Yamaguchi dealt with this issue, and his Honour said, well, I think the appropriate way of dealing with it is that if you have to make a currency exchange and work out what that happens to be, well, you should use the average for any of the past losses. So the average rate between the date of the incident and the date of the trial or settlement. And with regards to the future, you should use the spot rate at the date of the settlement or the trial. And with regards to what is the particular rate that you should use, well, the rate that you should use is actually the commercial rate. And the idea was behind that was that, well, whilst countries around the world and their reserve banks may be able to transact without a transaction cost, no transaction costs really associated with it, the average person can't do that and will actually incur costs with regards to any currency trade as far as a brokerage or things of that nature. Now, one of the other big issues is with regards to contingencies and vicissitudes. And if you think about it, the country and jurisdictions around Australia have very much become the type of thing that when you go to court or when you're going to a mediation or settlement, that there will be this standard deduction that seems to be applied with regards to an allowance for contingencies or vicissitudes. In New South Wales, it's 15%. Pretty much in Queensland, it's probably 10 to 15%. If you in other jurisdictions, it might be less than 10%, but there's still some sort of standard deduction that applies. Now, the issue there that you should think about is that whilst that may be the case as far as a person who lives in Australia, you might want to ask yourself, does that or should that standard deduction actually apply with regards to a claimant who's from overseas? And I say that because you should think about what the idea of this contingency or vicissitude is there to do. Now, for example, one of the things may be is unemployment. Now, in some countries around the world, they have extremely generous social security systems to help you during a period that you might be made redundant, or you're experiencing extreme financial hardship, some form of disability, or things of that nature. So really what's happened is, if you take account of these social security deductions when or taxes when you're calculating the losses, well, you really should take account of the fact that you're paying for it there. And if you were to then say, but at the same time, we think you should have a rather large vicissitude or deduction for contingencies, vicissitudes of 15%, that you might actually be taking a double dip with regard to that. The other thing to consider is that life expectancy. Now, one of the things that we deal with is contingencies and vicissitudes is, whether or not, what happens to be life expectancy. And in some particular countries, life expectancy is nothing like it is in Australia. So it may be appropriate in certain circumstances that the deduction that you should take account of should actually be higher than the standard deduction, because in a particular country, the standard of living and life expectancy is much worse than what we have here in Australia. So, just in conclusion with regards to this, and I'm more than willing to take any questions, or you're more than willing to, after this, send me an email and ask me any particular questions that you want. I think the big thing to take away from this is this. Whilst there are very similar principles in assessing damages for overseas claimants, being a comparison of what they would have earned and what they actually have or would earn, it is more challenging. And it's more challenging because of those types of issues that result purely as a result of where the person happens to reside. The other thing to understand is that when you're doing these things, you need to consider the individual circumstances of each claimant. So what you need to do is you need to take an interest in, for example, where exactly they would have resided, such that you may deal with these issues such as, the taxation that they would have paid in their local area. You need to consider whether or not they happen to be part of a particular pension system and things of that nature. So what you really need to do is you need to spend some time when you're preparing your particular case to understand all of these different things about the claimant and how they would have, their career would have progressed, or how exactly everything would have proceeded but for the accident. Don't rely upon rules of thumb. I know a lot of people like to use rules of thumb, but I can guarantee you if you try and use any particular rule of thumb, you're going to get it wrong, and substantially wrong. As I said in Yamaguchi, we were talking about a difference of 10% of what the future economic loss was. And I can tell you that the future economic loss in that particular case was quite substantial. So, if you happen to use a rule of thumb, you will invariably get it wrong, and in some cases you may get it materially wrong, and you don't want to do that. So that's essentially where I am on it. I mean, if anybody has any questions, I'm more than willing to answer them. My marketing people have told me that you can type something on the side here, and I should be able to see that. Alternatively, my details were in the start of that presentation, and the email address was mlee@vincents.com.au. So feel free to send me an email there, or alternatively you can call me on 0732284091, and I'm more than willing to just have a chat with you about any particular issues that you might have for any of your particular clients. So if there's any questions that you want to do on the side there, please do it. If not, I'll shut up shop in a couple of minutes.